In this video, I would like to introduce the remote review station. I actually created this because I needed a way to do QC tasks on audiobooks. I needed the ability to capture markers, and the other options available wouldn't work as smoothly as something like this would. I'm going to move into a demo, and I'll try to explain what's going on as I progress through the demo. One thing that I forgot to say is, realizing that the container and things could still use a lot of work, this is actually a Raspberry Pi with a 10-key calculator keyboard and just the normal power supply here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is plug it in. And it will take a second to start up. When it does start up, the light here should come on, even though it may be difficult to identify, and the announcement should be audible.
Remote review station, starting up. Attempting to mount cartridge. Book selection menu, please choose a book.
So the way that it works is, the Pi starts up automatically, then accesses the audio review program that's written in C. There will be a link to the program on the GitHub page with the code in the description for this video. Basically, the Pi automatically starts up, starts the review program, and mounts a USB stick. The stick holds the files. In this case, it just works easier to do it that way. I did start out with everything on the internal Pi memory, but it becomes difficult when trying to access files for downstream processes, and it's just easier to keep everything on removable media. So basically the Pi started up, and what's going on now is that it's waiting for the user to choose a book. This version of the program supports multiple books. I added that feature just because with the original version we could only do one book at a time, and it made the process a bit clumsy with all the exchanges of the physical unit, so I added the multiple books functionality, and that's where we are right now. I realize these buttons have not been labeled yet, but the 10-key minus button will cycle through the available books. Basically, it passes the title of the file name to the TTS, which reads out the file name. So let's cycle through the available books.
Squirrel. Skunk. Bears. Squirrel.
So essentially you can use the 10-key minus key to cycle through, and then you can use the 10-key plus key to select. And these are also plus and minus, but they're for volume control, and we'll cover that in a second. So when I find the book that I want, I choose it with the 10-key plus key. And then it beeps once to indicate that it is ready for playback. So at this point, we can push the playback button to begin playback. Or we can actually adjust the volume prior to beginning playback. The plus key over here increases volume, and the minus key decreases volume. I'm going to start playback, and we'll just try adjusting volume up or down as necessary.
Section 1 of The Adventures of Chatterer the Red Squirrel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
When pressing the volume increase button, once the top of the range is reached, it will start beeping. This is to indicate that it can't go any louder. I've actually set the range. It has to do with the SDL mixer volume functions. There's only a certain amount of loudness that we can achieve through manipulation of SDL mixer. So I set the range so that once we hit the top, it won't increase anymore. Just because after it gets to the top of its range, there's really no point. And once you get outside the range, the value of the associated variable continues to increase, so in order to bring it back down into the actual range, you'd need to hit the minus button a bunch of times, and it just turned out to be really messy. So this is just a countermeasure for potential volume control issues. Okay, so the other thing that I did was I pushed the playback button again. And pushing the playback button a second time has the effect of pausing playback, but it also drops a marker. In the beginning of the video, I said that I created this for QC, and basically what I needed to do was allow the user to indicate problematic locations in the recording, and I was looking for a way to do this without having to interact with a screen, because some users have issues interacting with screens. So basically I wanted this to be a screenless solution. Pausing the recording does pause the recording, but it also adds a marker to the marker file, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a second. And in the fourth section, marker files in Audacity. Pressing the playback button again resumes playback.
The Adventures of Chatterer the Red Squirrel by Thornton W. Burgess. Section 1. Chatterer the Red Squirrel runs for his life.
Right now the recording has been paused again. A marker has been dropped. I didn't really explain about how the marker creation procedure works. Basically, it writes the time to a file. There's a timer inside the program, and basically it writes the time out to a text file. I guess I also forgot to mention, but when you push the stop button it will kill the pie. And when you restart the next time, a marker added when the pause button is pushed is also added to a separate file that tells the player where to start the particular file on playback. Basically, there's no rewind or fast forward functionality right now, and it's sort of one of the possible improvements, but the markers allow the user to not have to start from the beginning every time, because that could be very problematic. So the other thing to point out while we're paused here is that you can access the book selection menu again from any point by pressing this key, which again, I know, is blacked out.
Book selection menu, please choose a book.
So that's taken us back to the book selection menu. The important thing to point out is even from pause, whether the player is stopped or whether it's returned to the book selection menu, the last marker that you added, because of the way that it's written, will always be written to the file. So, even during playback, you could go back to the book selection menu with no marker issues. During pause, you could go back to the book selection menu with no issues. One important thing to point out though is that, by default, no book is selected. So what happens, for example, if the user decides to proceed without selecting a book, or maybe accidentally presses the selection button without selecting a book first?
Book not selected, please choose a book. Book not selected, please choose a book.
So essentially, in order to leave the book selection menu, you have to choose a book. I built in a little bit of extra error handling when I realized that was an issue. So we will cycle through again.
Squirrel. Skunk.
And we can choose our book. And we can begin playback again.
Section 1 of The Adventures of Jimmy Skunk. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Leader. The Adventures of Jimmy Skunk by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 1. Peter Rabbit Plans a Joke.
Okay, so we are in the audio file called Skunk, which is taken from the title of the book. And we just added the last marker at the beginning of Chapter 1, so let's see how the resume functionality works. So let's go back to the book selection menu.
Book selection menu, please choose a book. Book not selected, please choose a book.
It gets me sometimes too. I need to label those buttons.
Squirrel. Skunk.
Okay, so we've chosen Skunk again. And this time playback will start from the last marker that we dropped.
The imp of mischief, woe is me, is always busy as a bee. That is why so many people are forever getting into trouble.
Essentially, because of the way that the markers are written, even changing books partway through with the book selection menu will allow you to go to the last marker written in each file. So I think that we could go back for a second.
Book selection menu, please choose a book. Squirrel.
So maybe let's go.
Skunk. Bears.
Okay, so let's do bears. So bears we have not actually listened to or added any markers to yet, so it should start from the very beginning. So let's choose it. Let's increase the volume a little bit. And then let's begin playback.
Chapter 1 of The Bears of Blue River. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tanika, Madison.
Okay, so we've just added a marker there, So again, let's go back to the book selection menu and see if we can get an idea of how it happened.
Book selection menu, please choose a book. Book not selected, please choose a book. Squirrel, skunk, bears.
Madison, Alabama. The Bears of Blue River by Charles Major. Chapter 1. The Big Bear. Away back in the 20s, when Indiana was a baby state and great.
So now we have our book files, and we have some markers in them. So let's say that we want to be done reviewing for today. So that is where the stop button comes in, and I talked a little bit about that at the beginning. But basically we need to push the stop button to exit playback.
Powering down.
So essentially at this point, we have stopped playback. We used the stop button so after playback has been stopped, i.e. once you push the stop button, the program will actually terminate, and in doing so it will actually shut down the Pi too. So at this point we could effectively unplug the Pi, and then the next time that we wanted to use it again, we could plug it back in and access all of our files again with the markers that we saved the last time. Next, I would like to look a little bit at the directory and file structure, like how the files are managed and created and things on the removable media, so let's do that. Basically we have 3 directories. Books, which is where the actual audio files are. Marker locations, which is where the marker files get created and written to. And stop locations, which is where the stop locations are saved. So examining the contents of books here, basically we have our audio files. They are all .ogg files. The reason for that is to ensure that the resume function works. For some reason, they need to be .ogg. I did a trial with .mp3, but it really didn't work that well. After I switched to .ogg, I was able to ensure that marker locations and stop locations actually matched the correct locations in the audio file. Next, let's check out marker. So we have a marker file corresponding to each of the audio files. Basically these are created the first time that you save a marker, so prior to saving a marker, these files do not exist, but actually saving the first marker creates the file. Next, we can examine one of the individual marker files. They're saved in Audacity format, but this could actually be modified to anything. It was just easiest to use Audacity format. Audacity format for markers works for other applications too, so that's why I did it. Last, we have stop locations. And then again, if we examine stop locations, there's only one marker, and this indicates, or this actually would correspond to the last marker added in terms of location to whichever audio file. So each time that you add a new marker, the stop variable actually gets overwritten with the newest marker, but the file itself only contains the last value. On restart, reaccessing through the book selection menu, the player uses it to sort of skip to the location indicated by the last marker. Next I would like to talk about how this works in Audacity. So let's go back over here and I'll bring up Audacity. So we're back in Audacity now, and we're working with the skunk file. In order to add markers, we would go import labels, I guess. They're called labels in Audacity. And we want to go marker locations. We want to use skunk markers because that's the file that we're working in, and then we open them. And here we have the markers that we added. And they appear, so I guess at this point, I could change the labels on these if I wanted to. They all just say marker by default, because that was the easiest way to do it, but you could change these to something else. And then you would know that those are the areas that need to be focused on for editing or corrections or whatever is needed. Finally, I'd like to take a minute to address some improvement ideas for the player, so I guess one thing is obviously labeling some of the buttons that aren't labeled. In addition to that, maybe having some kind of tactile labels. The labels right now are a little bit small, and since one goal is to help people that have difficulty seeing buttons and things, having small labels isn't the best idea. Maybe some kind of tactile label, that would be easily identifiable by touch would be helpful. Another thing would be volume adjustment. Right now, it only works within SDL. There was a conflict between the TTS and SDL where SDL tries to take over audio. So, I think it would be very helpful to figure out some kind of way to make them work better together, or control the volume separately somehow. Another possible improvement that I could think of is book selection menu. I'm using a linked list right now to store the book file names. And going through the book selection menu, there's always an empty entry at the end. I haven't quite figured out how to get rid of that yet, but it's something I intend to continue to work on, along with other improvements to the design of the program. Another thing to point out is that SDL is great, and thanks to the way that it works, none of the buttons work unless I program button functionality. Which means pressing any of the other, non-control buttons, doesn't have any negative effects. The only buttons that actually do anything are the ones that I was pressing in the demo. Also, and more obviously the case. And the interaction method using a 10-key keypad isn't ideal. It would be nice to have a dedicated solution. A dedicated general-purpose input-output type solution would be really great, since we could theoretically do that on the Pi. I think there are probably more areas that could maybe be examined, and hopefully, I will have some time for updates. The current plan is to periodically reflect updates to GitHub. Thank you for listening.